Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. My name is Julian, and I'm so glad that you're here. If you're curious what this live stream is about, basically every single Monday morning, I host a 1 hour Introduction to Philosophy and Theory lecture series. I used to work as an academic at the University of Oxford Brookes, but during the pandemic, we shut down and I started hosting lectures online for free. I've really just kept it up. And so for the past 3 years, I've been hosting these classes. And I'm really happy that we've created this community of people who are into philosophy and who enjoy learning together. I'm currently in Spokane, Washington, after a couple of days in Idaho where I went hiking and I swam in alpine lakes and contemplated nature, etc. But now I'm back, and I'm very pleased to say that next week I'm going to be in Europe. In fact, I'm going to be in Europe for the next 3 months. I'm going to be going to, let's see, Brussels, Bruges, London, Paris, Hamburg, a whole bunch of places, potentially Copenhagen. So I'm very excited about that. But today I would like to continue the Guide to Hegel lecture series that I've been hosting for the past couple of weeks. You're absolutely invited to join. You don't need to have any background in philosophy in order to participate in the series. However, a quick note, which is that these lectures are, hi, hello there. This is Molly. You can't really see her on camera, but this is Molly, our dog. Hi there, sweetie. Good morning. Good morning. Everybody's happy to see you. You gonna hang out here? All right. For those of you on YouTube, this is Molly. Say hello, Molly. She clearly wants to learn about Hegel this morning. So we're going to be continuing the Introduction to Hegel series this morning, and it is titled The Cunning of Reason, or in Hegelese, Die List der Vernunft. And so yeah, you can participate, no problem. It's free and open access for anybody who wants to join. But I do want to remind you that these lectures are, let's say, graduate level university lectures. So this is a pet project that I have where I essentially continue my teaching practice, and hopefully it's enjoyable and valuable for you. So feel free to dip in. And if you'd like to engage with these lectures a little bit more seriously, I would also highly recommend that you check out my Patreon, where you can download every lecture that I've ever taught, by now a couple hundred, as well as my ebook, The Complete Guide to Slavoj Žižek. All that and more you can find on www.patreon.com/Julian Philosophy. And a huge thank you, of course, to our patrons who continue to make this project possible. I simply wouldn't be able to host weekly lectures and all the work that's required to do that without your support. So thank you guys so much. And also, please do leave a comment letting me know where you're joining me from. It always makes me very happy knowing that we're connecting from around the world. So please let me know where you're joining me from. That is always an incredible privilege, knowing that we are genuinely connecting around the world. It really makes me very happy. So please do let me know. I see India. Hello, India. Very glad that you are joining me here. Denver. Hello, Denver. That's quite wonderful. Seattle. I just got back from Seattle. A wonderful city. Indonesia. Hello, Indonesia. India. Perth. Greetings to Perth. That's very far away. Wow. Portuguese watching from Bon dia. Ontario, Canada, Romania. Here comes Molly again. She's just going to be in and out a little bit. I hope you don't mind too much. Hi there, sweetie. Yeah, you know that I'm talking to the people on the internet. This is my dog, Molly. She's very sweet. I'm going to miss her very much when we are in Europe. Okay, so let us begin. She's come in like multiple times. She gets so jealous when I go on live stream. Hi, sweetie. Are you going to go with Jolene? No? This is, for those of you who missed her, this is Molly. She's wondering what's going on. All right, I'm just going to keep going and she can come in and out. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so let's begin. Apologies for the interruptions. Let us begin. This is going to be a continuation of the Intro to Hegel series. And I was reading a quite lovely book by Alenka Zupancic, What is Sex?, which is part of the series that Slavoj Žižek edits. I think it's called Short Circuits or something. And there's a lovely little anecdote in this book. So there's an anecdote about Hegel, where Hegel is living in Jena, which at the time was the capital of philosophy in the world. And Hegel was invited by his friends to go for a hike to see some of the surrounding landscapes. You have to keep in mind, you have to keep in mind that for the German Romantics, nature was a philosophical proposition. That to be in nature was to have an encounter with some kind of divine entity, or from a Schellingian perspective, a kind of Urgrund. And that therefore there was an ontological significance that was given to nature. Now, Hegel is not a German romantic, at least not in that sense. In fact, you could say that Hegel's work is entirely written against this notion of the idealization of the substance of nature in and of itself. However, Hegel was convinced to go out with his friends on a hike, not wanting to be a complete introvert, which Hegel clearly was. And he went out on the hike, and finally they got to their destination, and they looked at the mountains, the view. In fact, we actually have quite beautiful sketches of the surrounding landscape in Jena. And Goethe, one of the, of course, great German Romantic poets, traveled frequently to Jena, and we have descriptions of that landscape. And so Hegel had reached one of these peaks, one of these mountaintops, and looked over the landscape, and supposedly Hegel's response to this view is supposed to have been complete indifference. Hegel's reported to have said, "So ist es," which translates in English roughly to, "it is what it is." And it's a beautiful little anecdote to imagine Hegel, the great German idealist philosopher, toiling up this hill and surveying the sights and sort of giving the kind of like cosmic shrug, a thumbs down, if you will, that whilst all his friends are oohing and ahhing and taking selfies to post on their Instagram, that Hegel is essentially looking at this landscape and thinking to himself, it simply is. It is what it is. It's nothing special. Now, it's important to note here that Hegel isn't simply being a pessimist who doesn't draw inspiration from nature. Instead, one way to think about it is that we have here the difference in Heideggerian terms between Vorhandensein and Zuhandensein, which is it's a little neat distinction that the German philosopher Heidegger makes. So Vorhandensein is literally that which is at hand. It simply is. It exists. Zuhandensein is that which is there for you to be used. For example, this pen is zuhanden, or this pencil and this pencil sharpener are zuhanden. In fact, when we combine the two, they are zuhanden for each other, which is that you can sharpen the pencil, whereas you cannot sharpen the pen. And so Zuhandensein is a category that falls into what you might call instrumental reason, which is that something exists for a certain purpose. It's essentially a teleological category. It's moving toward its necessary function. Then we have Vorhandensein, which is that something is simply present. It exists in a state of its own existence. And for Hegel, this is what nature was. Nature, from an ontological perspective, was vorhanden. It simply was there. It was mute. It didn't speak. It didn't speak to him, nor could it be used. Of course, one of the transitions that we now, of course, refer to as the Anthropocene is precisely the transition from a nature which is vorhanden into a nature which is zuhanden. Namely, not simply nature as the kind of sublime, mute entity which does not speak to us, but precisely a nature which is crafted and created and used by us, and abused by us, of course. This is the joke about the Dutch and the Dutch system of the dikes and the land management, which is that God created the world and the Dutch created the Netherlands. Here we have the transition from nature being vorhanden to being zuhanden. And so Hegel looks at nature and thinks about nature in terms of it being vorhanden. It simply is. It's the inert stuff, the inert matter of nature. Of course, to make a leap forward, we could see here the question which I'll return to later in this nature, which is, whether nature is a category that we produce. In other words, whether nature is in fact vorhanden. Is it something that simply is? Or is nature always a category of reason that we retroactively impose on it? Similar to Luke Cox's famous notion that nature is simply a historical category. And to put that in, like, with a contemporary example, if you think about the function that nature has today, like returning to nature, or food going from the farm to the table, etc., the way in which goods are promoted as being natural goods, etc., natural fibers, we can see already how the very idea of nature is a historical category, a concept of reason that we use from an ideological perspective to suggest that something is not artificial. And so this very distinction between nature and the artifice is itself a form of artifice, if you will, a conceptual category. But we'll return to that in a moment. Now, from this story about Hegel, this anecdote, Hegel's indifference to nature, so ist es, it is what it is, we can make a transition to an article, again, that was suggested in Subhans's book by the nature writer Stephen Jay Gould, who is one of my favorite writers, essayist. And he has an article called Adam's Navel. And Adam's Navel tells the really remarkable story of the British naturalist Philip Henry Gosse. And Philip Henry Gosse was a contemporary of Darwin's. And he had a really interesting and quite unique perspective on Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, from a creationist perspective, evolution would, of course, seem to suggest, or readily suggest, that the world is much older than the Bible would suggest. And for many people, this created a problem. Either you believe in evolution, the scientific fact, or you believe in the idea of creation in the Bible, which is not a scientific fact. And Henry Gosse had a beautiful, if you will, solution or trick to rationalize, to essentially combine a form of creationism with Darwin's theory of evolution. And it works like this. Henry Gosse argued, what if God had not only created the world, but also created fossils? In other words, what if God created a backstory for existence? In the same way that, like, you know, you watch the Lord of the Rings movies and they're more convincing because the intricate patterns on the armor suggest a long standing culture and history that we don't know anything about, that we immerse ourselves in the world because there's the suggestion that there is a past going back, a past which Tolkien himself fleshed out. In the same way, Gosse essentially argued that God, in order to make our existence more believable, had simply fleshed out a backstory. That God, therefore, had not just created the possibility of a future, but had also created a past, an origin story for the universe and the world. And that as we moved into the future, we were therefore also discovering the past. Now, of course, let me be very clear. This is a fairly crazy theory, but it's an interesting one nonetheless from a philosophical perspective. Because essentially what Henry Gosse is positing is that we have here a kind of twofold God, a dialectical God, if you will, who thereby creates not just the present, but also the past, a past which reinforces the idea of the present in as much as it is discovered as we move into the future, which is a fascinating proposition. But secondly, it also creates the idea of a deceptive God, a God who lies, a God who essentially tricks us into believing that the world started at one point in the Bible, only so that we could then discover that it in fact is much older all along. Slavoj Žižek has likened this trickster God to a video game programmer or developer who essentially, where you, as you walk into the world, the trees and the horizon renders in real time as you walk into it. The way in which Žižek describes it is a God who essentially, that we've essentially caught God at his own game, that our scientific discoveries are moving so rapidly that God has to retroactively create more layers of existence that we can dive deeper into subatomic layers, etc. Now, the point here isn't to make an argument about faith or about God. Instead, it's a philosophical proposition. In fact, what's interesting is that Henry Gosse's theory was not accepted by his religious contemporaries. In fact, he was widely renounced as being a blasphemer. Again, the reason for that is that if there were a God who had created the fossils, who had essentially given us a backstory, then this would suggest that God is a deceiver, that God is a trickster. In fact, that God is like someone who has created an escape room that we have to figure out how to exit, to liberate ourselves from the idea of God as a will, which of course would posit a very radical, blasphemous assumption, which is that the ultimate form of the faith is therefore precisely to lose one's faith, to exit the faith. Excuse me. The reason that this is interesting, excuse me, I know slightly dry air here. The reason that this is interesting to me is that it essentially posits a God that conforms to the Hegelian notion of the cunning of reason. From a Hegelian perspective, the cunning of reason, or die List der Vernunft, is that the way in which history functions is not according to linear terms. In fact, one of the primary things that you have to abandon if you're going to study Hegel seriously is any kind of assumption of linearity. Hegel's entire philosophy, his dialectic, as we talked about last week, is an argument against linear temporal sequences in which we simply have a movement from 1 to 3, or thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Instead, Hegel's ontological proposition, in other words, his proposition about being, is precisely that what is always emerges retroactively through its own antithesis, which of course is highly abstract. So let's flesh that out a little bit. One way to flesh that out is to focus a little bit on Alain Badiou's theory of the event. Alain Badiou is a French philosopher, a French materialist philosopher. And Alain Badiou essentially posits an ontological proposition as to human subjectivity and freedom, and what you might call the void of pure multiplicity. The void of pure multiplicity is essentially the chaos that surrounds you all the time, in which anything could happen to anyone everywhere. This is, in a sense, also what the existentialists were grappling with, how man creates himself against the backdrop of pure multiplicity, a multiplicity which therefore includes his own possibilities. Now, Badiou essentially argues that the subject is never a neutral, a priori position. Subjectivity is not something that you begin with. In fact, the subject does not produce his reality, but reality produces the subject. However, this would be altogether too passive, too deterministic, like you're simply following in the footsteps of some kind of predetermined path for you. Instead, for Badiou, it's a dialectical proposition about subjectivity, which is that every subject is faced with choices, and therefore the choices you make create or produce subjectivity retroactively. Now, that seems pretty self-evident. Obviously, you have to choose, and part of free will is that you can make choices between things, etc. But this is where Badiou is quite interesting. Badiou says that whenever you have freedom of choice between things, this is essentially a meaningless choice. That to simply step back and be able to objectively choose between different options is an illusion of choice. Of course, one of the ways in which we experience this today is that we identify as subjects by means of being consumers, and that to be an emancipated subject, supposedly, within contemporary consumer culture, is therefore to make the right decisions between different products. Like, you will buy one car because this says something about you. You can buy a watch that is made of ethically sourced, recycled plastic waste from the ocean, which costs $500 and therefore signifies that you are an ethical consumer, etc. The primary way in which we construct subjectivity is therefore not just based on how we choose, but increasingly in a consumer society, our identity is predicated upon that which we choose between. And think about all the signifiers of status and identity that we have today. In the United States, if you drive a truck, it says something different about you than whether you drive a Tesla, for example. And none of these things are forced. No one is forcing you to do them. And so we identify according to these relatively meaningless choices that are supposed to recreate us in our own image as having a certain status or identity for others. And this happens on every level. It happens in terms of the clothing that you wear. It happens in terms of the podcasts you consume, etc. There's many myriad ways in which we can choose between things. In fact, you could argue that capitalism provides you with perhaps not the freedom to do anything, but certainly with an enormous freedom of choice between different commodities. Badiou argues that this is not how subjectivity is produced. It's not a choice between things. It's not the free, arbitrary choice amongst things that are fundamentally the same but signify small differences. Instead, for Badiou, paradoxically, true subjectivity only comes into play when you feel like you don't have a choice. This is what Badiou calls the event. And an evental circumstance is when something happens that essentially forces you to make a decision. This is what he calls fidelity to the event or loyalty to the event. In other words, it's not simply that the subject recognizes an event for what it is. A subject recognizes himself in the event. Here we actually have a link that we can make, briefly, between Badiou's theory of the event and Althusser's theory of interpolation. So Althusser's theory of interpolation is essentially the idea that subjectivity is the retroactive product of being heralded or interpolated. An example that Althusser gives is that there's a policeman in the street, and the policeman at a certain point says, hey, you there, right? He's like chasing someone. Now, if at that point you turn around to face the policeman, thinking for a moment that you are the one who's being called by the police, that you are the guilty party, you have therefore been interpolated. That subjectivity is therefore not something that stands on its own grounding, but that it is a recognition of yourself in the call of the other. Of course, it doesn't have to be a policeman. In a sense, you are constantly being interpolated. If you're driving a car and you're reacting to traffic signs, this is a form of interpolation. You recognize yourself as being the recipient of the message which is being given by the traffic signs. But on a much more contemporary, perhaps even problematic level, this is what is happening online all the time. Every single TikTok or Instagram video that seems to be addressing you directly is therefore creating the idea of you as a subject. It's interpolating you. When you post something to Instagram and you're trying to recreate the perfect life for the gaze of the other, or you feel like you can no longer enjoy things without taking a picture of them first and then posting them on the internet, you have therefore been successfully interpolated. Except in a sense, you've outsourced it to yourself. You're identifying as a person because you can now fully inhabit your experience by having recorded it and shared it with others. Strictly speaking, of course, we therefore exist in a kind of pathological psychotic state where you could do this without a following at all. Imagine that you have an Instagram account with 0 followers, and every day you take pictures of everything that you do, and then you post it to the internet. Essentially, you would have the same experience of, I exist, my actions are valid, I can enjoy them, and I can enjoy them on behalf of the other. This is, if you will, to borrow a term from Zizek, this is the pervert's enjoyment of interpolation, certainly online. The pervert is the one who doesn't derive pleasure himself through his own actions, but derives a second-hand pleasure by means of exposing it to others. And so when you take a picture of your food and you post it on the internet and you enjoy it more because you know that other people are liking it, essentially you are acting like a pervert. Not in a normative sense that you're being bad or that you shouldn't do it. Clearly there's real, genuine surplus enjoyment to be had here. But therefore, one of the primary modes of ideological participation in contemporary digital culture is along the lines of perversion, the pervert. The person who enjoys it not for himself, or who can only enjoy it for himself upon the condition that it is performed to the gaze of the other. And here we have the flip side of ideological interpolation for Althusser, which is that the subject not only recognizes himself in the heralding of the other, hey you there, but the subject creates himself to display himself in anticipation of the heralding of the other. You know that the algorithm is there to pick up the photograph of your breakfast and then send it to more people who will therefore recognize you as a subject, and you can enjoy your existence. Again, essentially what we have here is therefore the problem of subjectivity. Do I exist, and who do I exist for, and what do I exist for? Many people actually have this experience, I think, for the first time when they start journaling. We're often told that journaling, which I enjoy doing, that journaling is something that we should do to reflect upon our day, to sort of take a moment of peace and calm, etc., all of which is true. But one of the problems that presents itself with journaling is immediately, who am I writing for? Or what am I writing for? And a lot of people who start journaling will experience that they're essentially writing for posterity, which is almost a laughable concept even to themselves. It's like, I'm writing something down which will potentially exist once I am gone. And so I'm addressing potential readers of the future. But of course, if you do that, then it becomes really hard to journal, because why would you write down your most intimate secrets if you're doing it for people who will exist once you have passed? One way to circumvent this, of course, is the creation of a kind of neutral objective other, which we all recognize in the guise of Dear Diary. And Dear Diary, therefore, takes on the form of what essentially is a form of Freudian talk therapy. You can write anything, you can say anything, it doesn't matter, because your diary is going to be the mute other that simply absorbs all of it. And best of all, when you're done, you can just throw it into the, throw it into the fire and just let it be consumed. It's essentially a one-directional communication. But everybody has their own way of writing a diary, of course. There are people who write a diary their entire life so that it can be published posthumously, etc. The point is that the anticipated reader exists even if you're writing it for no one. That the subject doesn't simply act on its own accord, but the subject has to reflect itself through some obstacle, some barrier, either the reader or the absence of the reader. In Hegelian terms, this is therefore a form of negation. One of the things that you have to understand about Hegel, or at least which can be very helpful, is that every act of creation is also an act of negation, which is not, let me be very clear, not the idea that to create something is also to leave something behind, or that every good action has a bad outcome as well. It's not some kind of chaos theory. Instead, for Hegel, any positing is essentially also a counterposition, an antithesis. This is what Zizek, borrowing from Hegel, calls absolute recoil, or in Hegel's absoluter Gegenstoß, that everything which is therefore also a negation. To go back to the journal, to write is not simply a negation of the wood and the pencil, which is a negation of the tree and the paper required for it, and the negation of time in order for me to write something, and the negation of me in order to think something, and the negation of having had experiences in order to conceptualize ideas and then put them down in the journal in the first place. Nor is it the negation of my own identity, so that once I am gone, somehow something will exist that was when I was alive, etc. It is simply negation in the very act that any positing, any act of creation, any act of will is in and of itself a differentiation between what you decided not to do. And this is, to my mind, the reason that most people journal, which is that when they decide to journal, they're fundamentally choosing themselves. You can't really journal for somebody else. It's not a job. You don't really make money with it unless you've figured out some creative scheme. When you journal, you do something that thereby eliminates the possibility of having done something that isn't of your own choosing. It's an essentially solipsistic task. And therefore, the surplus enjoyment that we derive from journaling is the solipsistic self-relating negativity, which therefore functions as a reaffirmation of the self. The reason that I brought this up, this digression, is that it relates us back to the Badiouian theory of the event. Remember, I said for Badiou, The subject is never simply the neutral a priori subject who can posit things or who can choose between things. In fact, when we're simply choosing between things, we're engaged in a kind of meta subjectivity, a sort of pseudo activity, if you will, by which we feel like we've made a choice, but fundamentally we simply affirm pre-existing categories. Instead, for Badiou, true subjectivity is fidelity to the event. And perhaps the best example of fidelity to the event is one of the Hollywood tropes that you might be familiar with, which is that of the meet cute. It's also why Badiou identifies love as a form of the event. Now, in Hollywood terms, a meet cute, you might already be familiar with this, a meet cute is when two characters meet seemingly by accident, and this is what creates the preconditions, or posits the presuppositions, to put it in Hegelese, of their eventual romance, and how retroactively they might say that they were destined to fall in love, that they were soulmates, etc. Now, one of the classic meet cutes is two people walking their dogs in the park, and then the dogs become entangled in their leash, and then there's this awkward encounter that ensues where a man and a woman, usually a man and a woman, of course it doesn't have to be a man, it's heteronormative, they meet each other. The circumstances through which their encounter becomes possible is therefore contingently, accidentally created by walking their dog and the leashes becoming entangled. Now, of course, imagine for a moment that you would set out every morning with your dog thinking that this was how you were going to find a partner. I'm going to go for a walk in the park until my dog entangles itself with another dog, and then we will meet and fall in love, etc. Of course, this is never going to happen. It's totally unrealistic. The point, therefore, is that the meet cute is never something which can be engineered through, again, what you might call instrumental reason. It's not something that you would simply initiate. Instead, it's something which seems to happen in and of itself, by itself, contingently, which therefore presents you with the genuine subjective decision. If you like that person, are you going to meet again? Are you going to start a relationship with them? Are you going to risk a romantic encounter? And this, for Badiou, is fidelity to the event. The event is not some kind of epic, monumental sign that is given to you and to you only. Instead, strictly speaking, an eventual occurrence can be very small. It doesn't have to be like the ultimate event of the French Revolution and the liberation and emancipation of democratic participation, etc. It can be something very small. It can be something like two people reaching under the table to pick up a pencil and their heads bump. Another classic meet cute. And so what appears, therefore, as a contingent event, as a contingent act, therefore posits the subject with an authentic choice to risk it all, to ask that person for their number, to go out on a date again. And when I say risk it all, I mean that quite literally. Like, falling in love is called falling in love for a reason, which is that you completely abandon any sense of security, any sense of self. That person could hurt you a lot. And this is what, for Badiou, genuine subjectivity is about, something which appears to you as a forced choice. Now, you'll immediately be like, it's not a forced choice. Clearly, you don't have to ask them out. And yet, when you've experienced falling in love, you know that it's not that simple. You know already the right thing to do. You know already that this is the person you want to be with, or at least potentially. And so in a sense, it's already been decided for you, but you still have to act upon it. This is, again, how subjectivity is not the product, is not that which produces circumstances. It's not that you manifest it. It's almost exactly the other way around. It's that subjectivity is produced retroactively through following what appears to you as an inner necessity. I've mentioned this many times before, but Zizek has a really neat way of describing this. He says, an authentic act of freedom therefore always appears to you as pure necessity. And the example that he gives is if someone were to pass out in the street and everybody else walks by and nobody acts, nobody calls an ambulance, and then you decide to call an ambulance. And so an ambulance comes, saves this person, and later a local reporter asks you, why did you choose to call the ambulance when nobody else would? What made you a hero? And your response would probably be, and this isn't just false modesty, your response would be, well, I had no choice. But clearly you had a choice. Clearly the other people chose not to act. And yet retroactively, this purely contingent circumstance, which prompted in you a recognition as to the necessity of your own actions, in other words, fidelity to the event, created the circumstances by which you acted as a genuine, free, authentic subject. And yet retroactively, it appears to you as if you had no choice. Of course, I had to act. And now think about that in terms of a relationship. Most of the time when you're in a relationship, people feel like somehow they were meant to be, like they were soulmates. Even if you don't believe in the idea of a soulmate, you believe like everything in your life was leading up to this event. And strictly speaking, it's always a completely odd thing how two people who are complete strangers to each other somehow find themselves in the quote-unquote properly historical circumstances of accidentally meeting, thereby initiating what would be a life-changing encounter that would dramatically change who they are, or perhaps even unlock the full potential of their being, as it is quote-unquote supposed to be, and that somehow this would feel like a necessary, meant-to-be occurrence. In other words, like fate. And this is essentially the Kantian, Hegelian position on free will and fate, which is that fate is never simply the predetermined linear process by which you are following in the footsteps of some predetermined historical trajectory. Instead, ironically, it's the dialectical proposition by which your assumption, your finding yourself, you're following in what appears to you as a call, as an interpolation, is therefore how your genuine subjectivity emerges. That therefore fate is not simply that which you follow blindly, but fate is what you create. Vice versa, that fate creates you. And this is what Hegel means by the cunning of reason, or die List der Vernunft. For Hegel, reason is the overarching trajectory of history, but not in a linear temporal sequence in which you are the mere puppet of an overarching Geist or spirit, but how your very free participation and free assumption and realization of your own acts, which therefore are presented to you as almost necessary, creates subjectivity, which retroactively creates the substance from which the subject came. In other words, what you might call fate. And this is actually something that I think is always quite interesting in like the theory of predeterminism in Protestantism, which is the idea of being the chosen one or being selected is not something that you can simply start with. It's something which you have to prove to yourself and to others. Therefore, in a strange sense, being a good person doesn't simply start with standing back. You have to perform it for others. And this is one of the cosmic ironies, if you will, which is that you need the other to morally affirm you in your action so as to be recognized to yourself and amongst others as good, which in and of itself doesn't seem particularly good. Hence the Kantian problematic, which we talked about in a previous lecture, the famous categorical imperative, is not do unto others as others would do unto you. Instead, the Kantian categorical imperative is much closer to the Sartrean hell is other people. Not people are bad, but in order to prove that you are good, in order to be good, you therefore have to hope that others will ratify your actions as being good, which means having a minimal sense of self-awareness in the existing symbolic order so as to be able to do good. And the problem for Kant is therefore that there is no preordained morality, absolute morality, like the 10 Commandments, like this is what you should do in order to please God and be a good person. Instead, you have to take the leap of faith into the properly indeterminate participation in the ethical. And let me be very clear. The difference here between ethics and morality is that morality is supposed to be an absolute neutral good, but ethics is messy as hell. Ethics is, how do I actually navigate and test my moral propositions in the real world in reflection of others' activities and their own perception of ethics. And that therefore ethics isn't the opposite of morality. Ethics is, if you will, how you put morality into action. Ethics is the messy, contingent, properly subjective participation in the world in which your morals are tested and then retroactively reflected back onto you. But there's something beautiful about this as well, because if morality, for Kant, is an absolute good, then it can't be actualized without this recession into mere ethics. That ethics is therefore a poor reflection of the absolute good or morality, and yet precisely by the participation in the messy ethical quandary, what Slavoj Žižek would refer to as the vacillating of the semblances, very technical term, but we can return to that in another lecture, is therefore precisely how morality comes to pass. That which is supposed to be a pure, impure, impotent reflection of the moral good, namely ethical participation and all that comes with it, is therefore the necessary unfolding of the idea of the absolute good, of the idea of morality. And here again, we have the Hegelian idea of absoluter Gegenstoß, or as Žižek translates it, absolute recoil, that the positing of morality is not an a priori neutral Vorhandensein. Instead, it's the impotent version of morality, the fact that you can't reach it and therefore have to rely on ethics and ethical participation in the social order. In other words, that the subject is the retroactive creation of the heralding by the other. In this process, in this messy process, morality itself is retroactively, ontically produced. And so in a weird way, it's almost as if morality is interpolated by the subject through the subject's impossibility of acting in correspondence with the absolute good. And here we can finally see how for Hegel, the idea of absoluter Gegenstoß is absolute. It's not absolute in terms of there's a predetermined spirit and existing in the world is simply the antithetical participation in failed attempts to reach this. It's that the very failed attempts are what retroactively constitute the absolute. That the only thing which is absolute is precisely, therefore, this impossibility of the absolute in the world. And we can explain that or explore that more in other lectures, bit by bit. The point here is that, to go back to Badiou, to go back to Althusser, to go back to Hegel, we don't simply have an absolute which is given to us a priori. It's that the absolute, the true character of something, emerges too late or retroactively by succumbing to what it appears to be its impotent form. That therefore true subjectivity is not choosing between things. It's feeling like you have no choice but to act, and therein you find yourself. It's like the aphorism that you only find your true self in moments of hardship, right? It's similar to that. And the point, therefore, and I realize that we're opening a lot of ideas here that I'll have to explore further, is that here we have the beginnings of the difference between idealism and materialism. Idealism posits the idea of an unknowable, absolute substance, for example, nature. If you will, this is the difference between Fichte and Schelling. Fichte and Schelling are the two most important predecessors to Hegel, although of course the ultimate predecessor is Kant. And Kant, in his quote-unquote empirical inquiry into the idea of the pure form, created an impossible problem, and I've said this many times before, which is how do we think essence, which has always been the goal of idealism, going all the way back to Platonic idealism and the allegory of the cave. How do we think essence if essence is already made impure by means of being conceptualized through reason? Now, the two corresponding answers to that, which deviate entirely, are the Fichtean response, which is to posit an all-positing I, or Ich, the Fichtean Ich-Philosophie, the I philosophy, in which subjectivity has priority over essence, that the subject posits the ontological categories of reality, or the Schellingian response, which is therefore the exact opposite, which is to posit an almost mystical Naturphilosophie in which essence exists on a transcendental, non-accessible horizon, an Urgrund, a kind of ultimate a priori that we see reflected within nature. Hegel simply arrives on the scene, and we could imagine Hegel going on a hike with Fichte and Schelling, Fichte being older, Schelling being Hegel's more contemporary. In fact, Schelling invited Hegel to come to Jena in the first place, saying this is where you have to be because this is where philosophy is happening, which was true, but true like 10 years before. In fact, when Hegel arrived in Jena, most of the philosophers had already started leaving. But anyway, we can imagine Hegel, therefore, going on a hike with the old Fichte and with Schelling, and realizing that both of them were wrong, that Fichte's absolutization of the Ich was instead simply a hysterical response to Kant's inquiry into the positing subject, if you will, the ultimate form of a Cartesian cogito, namely not the one who simply doubts the world, but who creates the world through his doubting. And then we have the Schellingian mistake or error, the necessary mistake, which is the assumption of a Naturphilosophie, of an absolute unknowable grounding upon which reality is based. This is Schelling's notion of Anstoß, that which gives the, if you will, the first anticipatory movement of creation or of being, the kind of neutral foundation. And Hegel takes these two positions, namely the position of the absolute I, Fichte, and the absolute ontic substance, Schelling, and combines them in a dialectical approach. And therefore, in a sense, sublates both the Fichtean and the Schellingian position into what therefore would become the Hegelian dialectic. And what's key here is that Hegel, even though Hegel is supposed to be the grand idealist, and clearly Hegel is an idealist, that we see within Hegel's idealism the beginnings of materialism. And the central premise of materialism isn't simply that things exist. This is always the fake reading of Hegel, that Hegel believes that everything melts into air, but how can we combine Hegel's mysticism supposedly with, you know, the hard facts of reality? But nothing could be less true. Hegel resists idealization. He resists the idealization of Schelling's conception of nature. Remember Hegel looking at nature and saying, it is what it is. It is matter. He also resists the idealization of the subject, the all-creating positing of the Fichtean subject. Instead, Hegel's dialectics creates the pathway for what would later become a dialectical materialism, which is that material, the material aspect, what is zu handen, to put it in Heideggerian terms, is always a reflection of the irreducible gap, or to put it in Zizek'ian terms, crack, between the absolute and the subject, between substance and subject. And therefore, Hegel's aphorism isn't simply substance as subject, but also the irreducible nature of substance as not subject. It's not simply a band-aid that he applies to Kant. It's the extrapolation of a much more radical idea from within the Kantian critical framework, which is precisely the idea that substance creates subjectivity, inasmuch as subjectivity retroactively creates substance, the positing of the presuppositions. And that, therefore, the idea of reason is not instrumental reason. It's not man exists on a linear temporal sequence where he discovers more and more about the world until the truth of the universe is made manifest to him. Instead, it's closer to the quote-unquote crazy story from Philip Henry Goss about what Stephen Jay Gould calls Adam's navel, God creating a past and a future. Now, if we substitute God here for the idea of nature, we can therefore see how man creates and produces the category of nature in as much as God as man produces the idea of subjectivity. After all, if nature is something to be studied, to reveal the truth of the universe back onto ourselves, then in this very participatory act, this engagement and inquiry with nature, man's true nature is revealed to himself. And therefore, this is also where Zupančič says that the Galilean innovation is therefore the production of nature as a historical category through which man reveals himself to himself. And this fundamentally is therefore the teleological category that Hegel has in mind with the idea of absolute recoil or absoluter Gegenstoß. That man, or subjectivity, is therefore the self-relating negativity of the absolute unto itself. And that man is not simply therefore determining as to how he might act in reflection of the absolute, but that the impossibility of following the absolute is precisely how it is made manifest. In other words, the absolute is not the gap between things. The absolute is the immanence or the self-relating negativity of the gap unto itself. And the ultimate, quote unquote, primordial gap is therefore the gap between substance, the absolute, and subjectivity. And that is Hegel's insight. That is Hegel's response to the Fichtean and Schillingian positions, which is to radicalize them, which is to bring them in dialogue with each other, to essentially dialecticize them. And the primary differentiator between idealism and what would then become materialism after Hegel is that idealism posits a closing self-referential loop in which everything fits. And yet it is precisely within Hegel that we have the beginnings of a theory in which there is something extraneous, something which does not fit, something extraordinary that is produced by this irreconcilability between substance and subject, between subject and object, that therefore creates spirit, namely that which is subject to the cunning of reason. And the material is therefore not the material world posited apropos the ideal world. It's that the material is the excessive third, if you will, category, the materialization of this gap through subjective participation in the world, in which the ideal is retroactively made manifest. And so the transition from idealism to materialism is therefore, if you will, the sublation of the transcendental dimension within idealism, which makes itself manifest in the material. And the name for that is dialectical materialism, which we will cover in the lectures to come. Thank you so much for watching today. I know there's been a lot here, hopefully some more accessible bits and some more difficult bits. Above all, I really hope that this is an invitation to you to start learning about philosophy and reading and studying philosophy in your own time. I'm so glad that you joined me today. And if you'd like to, download my complete guide to Zizek ebook, which collects the first 8 volumes of my lecture series in one handy ebook. Please go to www.patreon.com/Julian Philosophy, where you can find loads more supplementary educational materials. And I welcome you to be a part of our learning community. Thank you guys so much, and I will see you next week. All right, thank you guys, and I will see you soon.